to welcome everyone to our continuing GEMA Talks vidcast series. We're thrilled today to welcome Liz Moulton. Liz is a senior executive at Spencer Stuart, one of the leading executive search firms around the world. She's a member of the Communications, Media, Technology, and Telecom practice. She's also a member of their CEO practice, and more specifically, she's the co-leader of their sports practice. And we're thrilled to have you here. Hello, Liz.
Hi.
How are you today?
I'm good. Thank you.
And you're speaking to us from Boston, correct?
Yes, from Boston.
Great, great.
From my husband's home office.
Yes. Yes. For those who may not know on the call, Liz's husband, Seth Moulton, is a U.S. congressman from Massachusetts. So you're seeing this unbelievably patriotic background here. It's very nice. Boston's my hometown, so please say hello to it for me.
Yeah, of course.
Good. Well, look, lots to talk about, particularly given that you're in the epicenter of the search world, where people are often looking to help hire and build their business. So obviously a interesting time. Before we get into that, just want to make sure, just check on you. I know that you and your husband were both ill, and you think you had bouts with coronavirus. Do you want to maybe just tell our audience a little bit about that?
Yeah. So when my husband was sicker than I was, he had some severe chest pain. He had some other challenging issues with which has come out later, that you can have some challenging issues with your GI symptoms. Mm-hmm. He was extremely fatigued, and he called his doctor at the Veterans Affairs Hospital, which is where he still gets treatment. They didn't have any tests. And so they told him to, which is a sad commentary in of itself. So they told him to self-isolate. He called the congressional doctor, who's the doctor for the House of Representatives. And he said he may be able to get him tested if he came down to DC, but he wasn't even sure about that. So of course he wasn't going to go down to DC. So he told him to self-isolate. So that's what my husband did. He didn't fight to go get a test somewhere. I know sometimes people have been fighting to find them or to pull a few strings to get some, and he just thought that's not the way this should be. So we really just isolated ourselves and took care. I had some symptoms, but as I was saying to you, Rich, at one point, I had a lot of fatigue. I was very achy, and I did have some wheezing and a little bit of trouble breathing, but it was much milder than my husband's. And then to find out that actually it does affect men in often worse ways, and that women often have milder symptoms. So perhaps that's what we had. We won't know until the antibody test comes out.
But you're both feeling well now.
Yeah, we're both fine. We're both back to normal, and but it did take a couple of weeks, a good 2 weeks.
Wow. Well, I'm so glad to hear you are well now. So let's talk about the search industry. What's the state of the industry today, and how has it been impacted by the coronavirus?
Yeah, so it's challenging. It's probably a mixed bag in some ways. So the first, I would say, tranche of clients are in real desperate need for very key positions. So a CFO, a CHRO, where they've had positions that have either been open or they've had underperforming leaders, especially in areas that COVID-19 are really affecting, like finance and like the people of the employees. Certainly any CEO searches that have been going on are now even more urgent, needing leadership at the helm. But then in the sports world, there's $0 in revenue coming in to a lot of our clients.
Right.
For the first time in history, storied franchises like the Boston Red Sox or, NFL teams like the Philadelphia Eagles are getting $0 in revenue at the moment. So they've suspended, the NBA and MLB and NHL suspended their seasons and hoping for some way to come back. MLB actually never even got off the ground, but they're just unsure how they're going to do it. So all eyes and all attention is on that, on how you revive the 2020 into 2021 season and whether or not there can be one. The NHL wants to just come back and finish playoffs. They're talking about speaking to an NHL president, and they're looking at sites like in North Dakota and Saskatchewan to just stage the playoffs.
Unbelievable.
Hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue for them. So the search world has definitely been impacted by that. And a lot of our clients are in limbo, if not planning for a very difficult couple of years.
Yeah. Interestingly, which maybe folks don't know in our audience, that major executive search firms like Spencer Stuart have various parts to their practice, not just finding executives for clients. So talk a little bit about some of the other parts of your business right now, which I assume in some cases are probably more busy as we speak.
Yeah, so outside the individual searches, which is a lot of what we do when we come in and help organizations find a certain C-suite executive, we do a lot of leadership consulting, and that is thriving in many ways. Some of it is honestly just pro bono work of us helping our clients manage through this and letting them have a lifeline. I always say that being a CEO, and I've talked about this with you, is a very lonely job in many ways. You have to make really tough decisions. You don't always have people to lean on.
Right.
So search consultants become leadership advisors, become executive coaches. We have a formed area called leadership advisory services that is everything from executive coaching to CEO succession planning to board effectiveness. And that work is some of the most important stuff we can do right now, especially helping boards manage through this, thinking about ways we help leaders get through this. I've had CEOs of individual sports teams reach out and say, what are the other CEOs saying? What are your other clients saying? And what are you hearing? And are people still hiring? And is this a time where maybe I could make a change, because the talent might be picking their head up and thinking right now is a time of reflection and a time of soul searching for many. And so there are definitely more people who are open to new opportunities. I wouldn't say they're open to them if there's some far-flung relocation, but if they're within the same state or even nearby, people are thinking about it again. So there's a lot of advising and coaching and just moral support going on.
Yeah. Speaking of leadership, I think you can make the case, arguably, this is the most important and significant leadership challenge in the history of business for these CEOs and C-suite executives. What are you, curious, because you have an interesting perch, what are you seeing out there in terms of how CEOs and other C-suite execs are handling the leadership challenge?
Well, our own CEO, Spencer Stuart, I have to say, is one of the most inspiring I've ever seen. And there's a few very simple reasons why, and I've seen it in some of our sports leaders too, which I'll get to, but simply being compassionate and empathetic and caring, and every message a leader gives, putting people's families and well-being first beyond anything. So I've been blown away by my own firm and by the CEO here. His name is Ben Williams. He's just a wonderful guy. And I've seen that replicated in some sports organizations. I'm quite close to the CEO of the Boston Red Sox, who's a wonderfully caring, emotionally connected guy. He cares so much about his team. He cares so much about his staff. He's talking to the president of the Philadelphia Flyers, and she's worked with her parent company, Comcast Corporation, who has been fantastic in keeping hourly employees and in-season employees giving fair pay, and people who rely on the paycheck to paycheck. I mean, the sports industry is full of people in the stadiums and the arenas and the food workers and the janitors and the people who only get paid if the games go on. So you see some really incredible stories of humanity. I also just think you see some really tough things going on. The XFL was ended within a 4-minute conference call and without much explanation.
Yeah, that was incredible.
Unbelievable. I know a lot of it is probably leaders or hands are tied given bankruptcy proceedings, et cetera, but that's a really challenging way to lose your job within a 4-minute conference call. So I think everybody muddles through this and tries to figure out the best way possible. In the adjacent industries, sports like Activision Blizzard, Bobby Kotick gave out a cell phone number to 10,000 employees to be a lifeline directly to all employees. I happen to think an organization like that's going to thrive in this era, which deservedly so, but there's some real profiles and wonderful leadership, and not surprisingly, it's people who are always the most humane and the most caring that are really coming out as the true leaders here.
Yeah. I mean, what do you see as, do you think there will be sort of lasting impact or lasting changes in the executive search, or just in how your clients hire and how they think about hiring and the type of people they're hiring, or the type of requirements that they're looking for? Do you see potential changes there?
Well, one of the things about sports in the past decade, I would say, is that it's evolved into hiring much more complex, sophisticated leaders. And in a time like this, you need someone who's a complex thinker, and it is very layered and nuanced in how they lead. Sports has gotten by for a long time with some good talent and some just mediocre talent that has come from years and years of a bit of an old boys club and a bit of owners hiring their kids, sons, roommates, cousin. And that's really changed and evolved. You see it in the highest levels of leagues right now. You see some of the top people there who have had really blue chip backgrounds, places like McKinsey or Goldman Sachs, or an MBA from Harvard. And not to say it all has to be in the most blue chip possible, but have been in more challenging organizations. I happen to think a background like McKinsey is a pretty good one to have right now to help organizations manage through this kind of change. So I would bet that increases and enhances over the next couple of years, because no one's going to be making any additive hires that don't bring some kind of real strategic thinking to how to manage the lasting economic effects of this. The fact that these organizations are at $0 in revenue, mostly these sports teams, especially those that were in season or going to start their season, like baseball. That's a really hard thing to get out of. So you're going to have some really creative, thoughtful people leading.
And also, I imagine that you may see some more flexibility from maybe working from home and the like. So how does that impact potentially people being hired in a different way, or maybe there'll be some loosening of some of that?
Well, it's so interesting because I've done a lot of work for the NFL and for Major League Soccer, both of whom are quite office, FaceTime office cultures, I would say.
Right.
Not that their leaders aren't. In fact, Don Garber's a very progressive, thoughtful leader. It's just sort of been the classic way of offices, and I have to imagine people are going to be more flexible, seeing how productive people can be. I happen to think some of us as employees are going to be very eager to get back to the office a few days a week at least.
Right.
But one of the things I think it'll do is it will open up avenues for people, because if you are, for instance, I'm a working mom with an 18-month-old, and the ability to work at home a couple of days a week, which Spencer Stuart, of course, affords me. It's a wonderfully supportive firm that way. That allows me to stay very heavily in the workforce. So organizations and sports organizations that have been traditional, and I think will evolve and change. And I also think it's going to have a big effect on business travel and on client meetings. I think that you'll see a lot less of that. I think people realize you can be effective on Zoom,
right?
And all of the technology. And so, unfortunately, I think it's still going to continue for several years to hit hotels and airlines quite hard, because people will realize you can save a lot of money. As we look at cost structures at a place like Spencer Stuart, I mean, you think about the expenses of consultants or the expenses of any league or team in the sports side, that just people traveling, and you can cut a lot of that with this kind of efficiency.
So as a executive search executive, in some ways, one sort of silver lining here is it could open the aperture up for you to add more candidates to searches for you.
I hope so. I specifically hope so, because as you know, I'm very passionate about having women lead in male-dominated areas like sports, and I think it'll open up the interest and appetite for people to have more flexible working environments. The biggest reason women leave the workforce when they have children is and it happens, the numbers are staggering, and it happens quite often. Even I have friends who are Harvard MBAs. I have friends who are University of Chicago MBAs. Northwestern MBA. I'm thinking about all the people I know so highly educated, and they left because it's so hard to maintain a very rigorous job and then have to do, I joke with my husband, he's now seen all of the hidden work that we do, including making sure the right diapers are ordered, and, the hours for daycare are all sorted out, and things that makes it very hard when you have really challenging jobs. So if there's a lot of empathy for that, and again, I think it's been organization by organization. I keep mentioning Spencer Stuart, which has been very progressive in this way. But sports organizations have just been more traditional. I have to think it's because it's been dominated a lot by older white men. And so the idea of inclusiveness and diversity has been a longer time coming. And I think that could really change.
Yeah, great. So you did allude to the work you've done, being an advocate and champion for leading women to take more C-suite roles, and and particularly in sports where women are at the higher levels generally underrepresented.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about that work and your strong belief in that, and maybe some examples of some folks that you've helped and you've championed along the way.
Yeah. Well, my best example in the world is a mentor of mine, Val Ackerman, who's the commissioner of the Big East, very apropos to what we're talking about today. By the way, that was President DeGioia giving me a shot many years ago in the sports world, as well as another Georgetown alum, very famous sports lawyer named Joe Lasessi, who's the chairman of Costco. Those Georgetown alums got me launched into the sports industry, and it was Val Ackerman who was one of my very first successful searches. And she is, if you ask any woman in the sports industry, they'll point to Val as being, she's too young to be a grandmother, but the mother of all of us. she wouldn't like me saying grandmother, in terms of being breakthrough and breaking through the glass ceiling. And she's incredibly passionate about this. So A, she informally mentors a lot of us, and B, she's worked with me over the years of trying to formalize this. So there's been other big hires I've helped with, like Gary Bettman, who's quite progressive on women leadership. We hired a chief digital and marketing officer for him. He's one of the highest ranking women
NHL.
in NHL, the NHL. Talked about my friend Valerie Camillo at the Philadelphia Flyers. I had helped her when she was leading a lot of the business of the Washington Nationals, to build out a highly diverse team, including two or three leading women in her executive team. And the Philadelphia Eagles, Jeffrey Lurie is another one who is very progressive in this way. Really was, and it's been featured now in the Wall Street Journal, but I helped him with two very significant hires, chief marketing officer and chief revenue officer, both of whom are women. So and those are very high ranking roles for women. In fact, those are the pipelines for the CEO role. So hopefully they'll continue to change. So I'm very bullish on this. But going back to Val Ackerman, one of the things, and maybe the audience who listens to this can help with some ideas, we've tried to figure out ways to formalize how we can really help elevate women. And there's all sorts of ways we try and do it. Jamie Messler, who co-founded the Players Tribune, and I used to do a women's dinner, women executive dinner on a somewhat regular basis. We pulled together panels at the MIT Sloan Sports Analytics Conference, hosted by Jess Gelman, Daryl Morey. They're very focused on this as well. So there are, I think, fits and starts, and I think there needs to be some kind of industry-wide leadership on this and maybe formalized structure. So I'm hoping, Rich, you can help me think about this, because you've got a creative idea.
No, it's an area that I strongly believe in too. And I think one of the most important things about you, obviously sourcing and finding these great executives like Val Ackerman, is it does create that senior role model that a younger woman now can look to and say, wow, look, I can get to that role. There is a path. And I think historically, when you didn't have senior women in those roles, it's tougher for younger women to do that, I think, sometimes.
It's true. And Val raised two daughters who are now both thriving. And I mean, that's a big thing for us, is that we need to see that there are women who have, and people like Val have said to me, just get through it. They threw me these early years where it's tough because the kids are so little. And I mean, it's even tougher. You know better than I, but if you can manage through some of this balancing of how and I have a husband who's not here most of the week. So I have like a double challenge, but he's most of the week. But if you can get through it, and you can see a woman like Val Ackerman rise to where she's and by the way, the reason Val will say this very openly and said it at his funeral, the reason Val was able to do what she did is because of David Stern, who is extremely progressive in terms of women leadership, even though he had this reputation for being very ornery and challenging. Right. Also a mentor to Val Camillo, I'm talking about the Flyers, a woman named Melissa Brenner, who's one of the very top people at the MBA, EVP of digital. They're some of the most important stuff she's overseeing. He was a mentor to her. My friend Rachel Jacobson, who's the chief partnership officer at Landit, which is a platform for women leaders. I mean, it was people like David Stern. So it actually, as much as I tongue in cheek say sports industry was dominated by older white men, some of those older white men were extremely key. I sometimes talk about the owners and others, but like David Stern and Garber is very empowering, and their commissioner, Adam Silver, clearly, who's a disciple of David's. I mean, these folks are empowering women, and therefore they're women like Val and Melissa, and Heidi Browning is the one at the NHL that then can shine a light for all the rest.
I'd love to shift a little bit and talk about your career path and your career journey. I know you spent a lot of earlier years in the nonprofit sector. And so I'd love to, I know at Georgetown you played sports, right? You played field hockey?
Yeah.
And what did you major in? What did you major in at Georgetown?
Oh my gosh. So I started in the business school, which is interesting. I always knew, since I was a little girl, I told my parents I wanted to be an international businesswoman. I have no idea where I got that from, but I did apparently when I was very little. But so I started in the business school, and then I realized that Georgetown, some of its best offerings were in the college because, and so I essentially majored in government and minored in theology. It was almost a double major, but, and if you think about it, what Georgetown offers is being in DC with like these luminary alumni and professors who are involved in our national politics. And then the Jesuit community is just incredible in terms of the thinking and the intellect. And so I tried to take advantage of those courses as much as I could. I also did a lot of coursework in women's studies. And one of the first entrees I had to sports world was a woman. I mean, now I'm like age myself, but we called her Professor Bonnie, and she had a women in sports course that I took.
At Georgetown.
Yes, at Georgetown, yes. And it was all about women breaking through in the sports world. Now, it was a lot from the athlete side, but it was like Title IX, and it was, in the late 90s, it was still, it's much more common now to follow women athletes and et cetera. So yeah, Georgetown was the root of a lot of my career, and just this like expansive thinking about how the world should change and evolve. Georgetown was at the core of that.
Right. And then you got into so like when you graduated Georgetown, did you say, I want to be an international business person still, or that was sort of, you've moved on?
Oh, I did. I basically did. I was always in conflict with being an international businesswoman and then doing something altruistic. And then when you take these kind of, strength finders and Myers-Briggs doesn't measure this, but those types of tests, I rank very high in altruism, which is funny because I'm married to a guy who's totally driven by service and purpose, but
well, there you go.
Conflict of that. And I had one of my best friends was a year older than me at Georgetown, and she had gotten into this rotational program at a law firm called Mintz Levin, and they had an arm called ML Strategies, the famous Boston law firm. And they basically saw like Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs and all these banks taking these like smart, hardworking, young, aspiring people and then exposing them into different areas to basically get them inculcated into potentially wanting to do their kind of work. So it was this project analyst program. I'll never forget it. It's like come up in so many ways in my life, because there's now a very big leader at GE named Mo Cowan, who was at one point the interim senator, US senator in Massachusetts, that was a mentor of the project analyst program. He was a lawyer at Mintz Levin. Anyway, it exposed me to law, business, M&A, marketing. And so I basically got this like little mini MBA for 2 years after college.
Right. And then how did you shift to executive search?
Oh my gosh, that's a longer story. But then my altruism kicked back in, and because of Georgetown, where I had tutored at a place called C''00, an organization tutoring program called C''00, and I'd done SAT tutoring when I was at Georgetown to make extra money. And September 11th happened, and I was living right down by the World Trade Center. I actually had a picture window view from my apartment of the World Trade Center.
Oh boy.
Had a lot of people I knew from Rye, New York, including a very close friend of my larger friend group, a couple years older than me, who died on September 11th. I went the altruistic route and taught and coached sports. So I went to like a Teach for America type thing and coached sports. Long story short, I went back and tried to merge the two. after teaching into business, and I spent time at Harvard and went to the School of Education, but also took half my courses in the business school. And interestingly, executive search found me because I was trying to marry these two things, this like leadership and people orientation with the business world, which I found to be really fascinating and interesting and always had in my blood. And I got recruited off an airplane to do executive search.
Is that right?
That's why I got into it, by a wonderful woman who leads the nonprofit sector at Russell Reynolds Associates, which is a great firm.
And you felt like some of your passions and your skill sets matched well and do match well with the executive search world.
Well, it's funny because when I was at Mintz 11, I remember a lawyer, one of the corporate lawyers who I worked with, who, by the way, all the corporate lawyers I worked with at Mintz 11 told me not, and just lawyers generally told me not to go into law. Every one of them, every single one of them. Have you heard that? They're like, don't be a lawyer. But one of them I remember early on said, you have a real people orientation. You know who makes really good money? He was like focused on money. He's like executive recruiters. And I was like, what's that? I don't know what, because you're 22 years old. You don't know what an executive really is. So it had always been like something that weighed in my mind, but it just found me. And it is such an interesting thing, executive search, because it is the core of business, but it is the people part of business and the growth of leaders. And the growth of leaders is very human and very, as I say, the CEOs can be very lonely. And I joke, I can be a therapist to a CEO, which is like an honor to do. I mean, just let people talk through their challenges and their issues, but in a very business-minded, outcomes-driven way. My mom and sister are therapists, and I always said I couldn't sit there and listen to people where there was no conclusion. I need like an outcome. Like, okay, so what are we going to do? Let's do something.
Right.
Executive search really blends all that in an incredible way that it found me.
It's great. I always love to ask about people's career journeys, because they're interesting, but I also love to point out to some of our younger alums and students that it's often very nonlinear. People think, you work at a company and then after 3 years you get promoted and then you're at the same company. And I think a lot of people, especially in today's world, obviously there's much more fluidity. But to hear your story is
yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, hearing your story is a real example of that nonlinear side to it.
But you've had long tenures too, where you've been, in your, especially, parts of your career. But I always say too, like, I've always been very worried about not staying somewhere a long time. And in fact, I stayed at my last firm too long. It was not the best cultural fit for me as a firm. Mm-hmm. And now I think one of the most empowering things is realizing it's okay if you stay a year, 2 years. If you feel like you've learned something and it's going to pivot you to something better, go for it. Mm-hmm. I don't think people have to stay where, when you and I were coming up, it was like, you better stay 8 years or 10 years or whole career. And now I think one of the things that new generations have right is that a lot of opportunity out there. I still think in the post-COVID-19 world, there'll be a lot of opportunity, hopefully, when we bounce back. And so I think taking that opportunity and running with it has been something that I've done, and I was hesitant to do it first. Like, as I was saying, I stayed at a firm, at an organization that was not the right culture fit for me, and so couldn't have thrived as much as I could have. You have to seek out the right places for yourself.
Yeah. So given, the situation we're in right now and the challenging nature of it, an obvious question I think people would want to ask you is, this is two pieces. First part is more C-suite executives who are out there trying to find a job or have recently left a job and we're in the process of looking. What are you saying to those people right now?
Yeah.
What are some of the things they could be doing while they're maybe on pause, or is there any advice for them?
Well, one person I've been talking to a lot, one of the things I find the most refreshing, because I clearly talk to a lot of people who are in transition or who are talking about a transition because they're seeking advice or just trying to test the market and take the temperature of other organizations. I think the true authenticity of leadership, when people say, I tried this for a few years and it really didn't work out, and here's why it didn't work out. And people saying it very authentically and honestly, I think draws people to them. Mm-hmm. In sports world, especially in certain like sales and revenue functions, you will find people who it hasn't worked out. An inside story, and there's always multiple sides to a story. Right. They'll they'll try and say, well, I didn't want to be there, so I left. Right. And I've always found that lack of authenticity very challenging, not just because a little annoying to deal with as somebody who, when you really know the true story, but also because it's a most of all, it's a missed opportunity for that person to do some soul searching.
Mm.
As I was saying, I think if you can own where you've worked well and where you haven't worked well, and the types of leaders you work well with and don't work well with, if you can use this opportunity to really think that through and to, I mean, there's people who have time to give free advice right now. I'm one of them. I love talking to people about
Be
their.
careful, you may get bombarded with.
I know, but that's okay as long as people call and give me the real truth and authenticity of it. If they call and say that everything is by their own design and that they're the ones who rejected the organization, look, in the sports world, entertainment too, as we know, Rich, people get fired. Everyone gets fired.
Right.
At some point in your career, you get fired.
Right.
It could be that a new owner comes in and gets rid of all the people. It could be that a CEO doesn't like you for some political reason. It could be a variety of reasons. It could be you could have had some fault. You could have had no fault. It doesn't. So just understanding that and learning and growing from it. So one of the CEOs I've been talking to is really whatever you can tap into in terms of personal growth. I know that sounds like a little woo-woo, but I really believe it. And reading and reflecting, that is why I think there's very little silver lining about what's happening right now. But the one thing people keep talking about is that they have time with their family, they have time at home, they have time to reflect. Mm-hmm. And if people are not using this time for that, I'm not sure they ever will.
Like you said, time to learn too. Time to learn, get more informed and learn more about your
really
craft.
Critique yourself. I've made various mistakes in my career, a couple of which have been very painful. And I really critique myself more than probably people even know. And I think while you don't want to sit and self-flagellate, what it does is it helps you then figure out how to not repeat those mistakes.
Mm-hmm. That's great. And then on the other side of the coin, we have either students who are looking for summer internships or graduating seniors who are obviously going through an unbelievably challenging time, or even recent graduates who are still in the job hunt. What do you say to those younger folks who are quite anxious right now? I mean, I hear from a lot of them and unsettled. What do you say to them? What's your advice for them right now?
I know. Well,
there's no silver bullet. I know that.
Well, it's weird. In a weird way, the thing that flashed through my mind was like, they're kind of the lucky position because the stakes are low right now for them. It's very hard when an executive with an established family or established career, especially in media and entertainment, sports too, you can be in 1 second, out the next, and then you're kind of never back in. And it's very challenging. When you're young and you have a whole world ahead of you, you can test and you can try and you could dip your toe in here and dip your toe in there. And the stakes are, as long as you have a living wage, which is important. Right. But you can get a living wage by a whole variety of part-time jobs, right? And there's all sorts of ways. I would test and tinker a bit right now. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I always say, and people have told me this, there's a friend of mine she's now at Amazon, her name is Katie Bose, and she's a fantastic commercial developer. And, as part of executive search, you have to develop business a lot. And she'll always say that she loves to ask for the sale. And she doesn't care if people say no, like literally doesn't care. She's like, okay, you say no, no big deal. I think young people have to take that same approach. And that's what makes her so good. But take that same approach, which is like, what's the worst that can happen? Rich is not going to write you back. Mm-hmm. Who cares? Rich didn't write you back. Try somebody else, right? So right. I know you always write back, but I'm saying if someone of your stature, someone at CEO level like you, if you got a note from someone and you didn't have time or you didn't like the note, I mean, so big, so what? So people can reach out. There's all these famous examples of people getting into sports. There's a wonderful guy, Georgetown alum, named Tim Brosnan, who is Brosnan, who's another wonderful mentor of mine over the years. And he wrote MLB like a letter every week he would explain this better. We'll get his daughter on, who's another Dynamo, who's a Georgetown alum, and his son, Kevin. Yeah. And I think Charlotte's at Georgetown too. I think all of his kids. They're all. But and he wrote a letter a week for years or something insane like that to get himself into Major League Baseball. And so what's the worst that can happen? And Bud Selig never wrote back. I don't know, he was the commissioner actually, but no one wrote back. So I just think this is the time to really test it out and go for it. And I've seen incredible things happen by people just sticking their neck out and asking for things.
I think too, obviously the summer internship market is in some ways probably dried up, but there are opportunities, to your point about being aggressive. maybe there's somebody who needs help on a project and needs research work for 2 weeks, even if it's something, dipping your toe in and being able to find something. But you're not going to get that unless you ask and unless you show some ingenuity and some creativity. And, it could be a family, a friend, it could be a Georgetown connection, like you said, or somebody, if you are a sports lover and you're trying to do an internship and they've dried up for this summer, maybe there is something you could do that's more short-term based, or maybe working on a project with someone. Even that can lead to great doors opening and obviously education and learning more about the craft.
The only reason I was more senior. I think I was probably 35, or I guess so it's like early 30s. So I was a bit more senior than what you're talking about. But the only reason I even created a sports practice is because I went and I stuck my neck out to try and get this Big E search. And then I went and sat myself in Joe Lassese's office.
Good.
Called up Tim Brosnan, and by the way, all Georgetown people, and which is so amazing. Georgetown, yeah. And I just said, I want to do this. And Joe would never do this. He was the most gracious man, but he could have closed the door in my face. Tim Brosnan could laugh me out of the office, but they were just wonderful about it. So I wouldn't be here without that. And in my own firm, we have all these different practices, and I've had 2 or 3 different analyst level, which is like the entry level for Spencer Stuart. One of whom's in financial services, one of whom's in real estate, say, I want to be involved in the sports practice. And so they'll lend their time to the sports practice, and they help with any kind of research we need. And guess what? Now they're officially part of the sports practice.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, it's terrific. Liz, this has been really interesting. And again, so relevant and timely to what we're going through. So we really appreciate your time, and glad to hear the family, including you, are feeling better, and hope you get through all of this and navigate through this well.
Thank you for asking me to do this. I love it, and I love connecting with the Georgetown community. So count me in anytime.
Thanks, Liz. Take care and have a great day.
Okay, bye.